Hello and welcome to the Perpetual Traffic Podcast. This is your host, Ralph Burns. This is where we talk about sales, marketing, and we do not talk about the type of lawn furniture that you should have this time of year. Tom Shipley, we always say something really ridiculous in our intros here at Perpetual Traffic. We're not really sure if that's exactly the type of thing that will gather us more listeners here. But today, we're not going to be talking about anything ridiculous. We're talking about some serious stuff. I've got Tom Shipley here. And Tom is, if you don't know who this guy is, he's a serial entrepreneur. I'm just going to read off what he wrote to me because it's so good. Former Special Forces operator, which I didn't even know. We kind of touch on that somehow. Investor, strategic advisor. He's also built tons of beauty brands to over and sold over $2 billion worth of DTC marketing and retail. He's raised $100 million from private equity. He does Amazon aggregation. He also does private equity fundraising. He does growth through acquisition, and he's built actual brands. So if you are an agency owner, an e-commerce brand, or a business owner, this is the show for you to talk about different ways to grow and scale, which are not organic, which are primarily, I would say, your area of expertise is through M&A, through acquisition, which I am very interested in hearing more about, obviously. He also runs Ava Acquisitions, which is an agency aggregator. So if you're an agency owner, you might want to cue in on that. And really happy to have Tom Shipley on today's show with Perpetual Traffic. Welcome to PT Tom.
Hi, Rolf. It's great to be here. And I'm super excited to be talking about M&A because as a person who has done it, I'm going to say the difficult way. When I talk about building businesses from scratch and scaling them to a significant level, my analogy is it's kind of like being dragged through asphalt and glass. And when I realized that I don't have to do that each time, there is a programmatic way to do acquisitions and reduce all the pressure and the noise on the CEO and on me. It's like, this is like the coolest game in the world. And ultimately, as CEOs, we're always looking for that point of leverage where we can get disproportional return for the effort we're putting in. And that's where I'm excited to talk about M&A, though I spent plenty of time building brands from scratch and scaling them, which is also a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, I always say this: there's three ways to grow, which is you either build it, you borrow it, or you buy it. And you've done it all ways. Like when I say borrow, like in our agency sort of, M&A world, it's a relationship. You borrow that skill and then you say, all right, well, hey, this is working out pretty well. Why don't we merge forces kind of thing? So I think most businesses really look at, unless they're higher level, maybe in the hundreds of millions or even billions or even enterprise level, let's just say that, they don't really look at acquisition as a growth strategy. And I've talked to a lot of agency owners, a lot of business owners. We talk to a dozen business owners every single week, and most of them don't even have acquisition on their horizon. And these are e-com brands, service brands, any like that whole thing. So it's like, I think the world of M&A, people feel like it's in the ether, like it's so far away, or you need so much money to be able to do it. Uh, I'm a real estate investor. I think when I first started getting into real estate investing, I was always like, well, you need 20% down payment on everything. Well, there's this thing called private equity, is hard money lenders. There's always a way to buy a house literally with no money. And in essence, this is like a lot of the model, and we'll get into it here today, is that same type of mindset. You don't necessarily need to have millions of dollars in cash or dry powder in order to do acquisitions. And even if you're smaller, it's something like when I say smaller, under 10 million in revenue, for example. Maybe you've got some examples of really small ones, but in most cases, most business owners don't even think of this. And I think that's what's so cool about your background, is that you've built stuff organically, but you've also grown things through, acquisition and M&A, and done it in a really smart way, and oftentimes without a whole lot of cash outlay. So let's maybe take it back a few years. We were talking about like let's maybe talk about the tech bubble. You're like, which one? And when I always think about the tech bubble, I think about like the late '90s, early 2000s. Obviously, you've been through a couple of economic downturns, like I have as well. Uh, let's talk about like sort of how this whole thing started, and I think it sort of came out of the bubble for you to now doing what you're doing with all the different ways in which you've grown businesses.
So it's really interesting. I started my first platform 25 years ago. It was a online business, but it was always multi or omni channels. So we mailed out millions of catalogs. Over time, we went from 4 or 6 pages in Sky Mall magazine up to over a dozen pages. But these were all great acquisition channels for us. But along the way, is that model is that we had our overhead and we were keep on growing our customer base. The lifetime value of the customers eventually would cover our overhead. And at a certain point, when the tech bubble burst, access to capital disappeared. So here we were, a small fledgling growing company. I think we were at that time 6 or 7 million in revenue. It was an econ business, and we were growing, but we ran out of capital. And so my first lesson is, what do you do? Well, this is where the first accidental thing happened to me. Is an investment banker out of New York called me up and said, Tom, I had the perfect complement business for you as a division of Boise Cascade. It means nothing for them in their business. It's a $15 million business and they're spitting it off. I think you would be a great home for that.
Hmm.
The deal was structured in such a way that we're able to make a return our acquisition within 60 days. Again, the
Wow.
deal economics were so crazy. And again, that's a story for another day, but just from having no capital, out of resources, we were able to acquire a business, a division of a billion-dollar company, multi-billion-dollar company, and we were able to acquire without really resources. And basically, they gave us the foundation, and there was a merger. And then after a year, I exited for my next platform. So again, that was a aha moment, but I didn't really learn my lesson. 3 years later, my partner Drew and I started Atlantic Coast Brands, and basically started in an attic outside Richmond, Virginia. And the idea is we were going to build $100 million beauty brand. Now we were told that this idea of I took my playbook and I wanted to build an iconic, decade durable beauty brand using direct response marketing. We were laughed at in 2005 because we were told you will never, ever, ever be able to build an iconic beauty brand using direct response marketing. And my response was, let's show you what unit economics are all about. And basically, and it's about impressions and consumers paying for the marketing. And so with that, we launched hydroxytone. After a year, we went financially all in. I mean, totally all in. And we did $331,000 of revenue. Now, for you entrepreneurs who like to remember painful memories, is I had two small kids and he had two small kids. We got to the point is we didn't know how to feed our families. So one day, Drew walks in and says, Tom, what are you doing with that sheet of paper that you're filling out? It looks like a credit form, but I know that we're full, our credit cards are maxed. I know that we can't get any more. I know that our house are mortgaged. So what's that? I said, I own two cars. I can take out loans against my cars. He said, print one of those off for me. We figure out a way when we don't have the resources. And I learned in the Army is something that many of you have heard, is that you never have enough resources, no matter what. It's about resourcefulness. So the resourcefulness was getting access to capital, keep on going. It was bringing on a client that helped pay our bills. And then it was this company that we were consulting in Richmond, Virginia. And the challenge, after achieving that whopping $331,000 in revenue, but without any more money, was that how do we go on? Because the economics of what we were doing, our customer acquisition costs were just dead in line with our business plan. Our lifetime value of the customers was almost double that when you take out, and basically from a contribution perspective, so the units work, we just didn't have enough volume there and could not afford the growing of the media and the cash flowing we needed for the consumer financing we were doing. Because it was a risk-free trial, and eventually went into the Guthrie-Rinker model, which sucks cash. So what do you do is basically we turned to the company that we were consulting. We said, we love your business. You have this $15 million business making $1.5 million of EBIT a year. We're either going to replicate what you're doing or we want to buy you. And they were a young couple. They said, well, what do you mean by buy? And we basically were able to buy their business for 2.5 times EBITDA. Now, which was incredible, 85% in cash, 15% on earnout. They made more out of that 15% when we bought that bath than they did the 85%, just to give you perspective. But what that did is they had an infrastructure from fulfillment, they had a CRM, they had a microsite platform, what we call a funnel builder now. They had an accounting department, so they had everything we needed. So we took hydroxytone, put it on their platform. Fast forward 3 years later, we did 100 million in revenue. We did over $1 billion in revenue on that first brand. But again, we were done. It was an acquisition. You do not need capital or have immediate access to capital in order to do acquisitions. And so if I look over my lifetime, it was opportunistic things that came up when we needed to that I did acquisitions, that we did acquisitions. So fast forward a number of years later, the 4 or 5 years, like 5 years ago, the paradigm shifted is why should acquisitions be opportunistic when they happen and come along or through conversation? Why can't these once in a lifetime deals happen on a regular, almost monthly basis? Why can't we take the complex like we do as engineer anything? Why can't we turn it into standard SOPs and make this a boring part of our business and just acquisition as a predictable way of growing? And that's what we do right now. We do programmatic mergers and acquisitions.
So take us to, so I love the idea of, I think the idea of an acquisition for somebody who's never considered it as a business, whether you're an agency owner, whether you're an e-com brand, you're just starting out. Like most people think it's so complex and complicated. I need somebody that has the insider's playbook. I need to hire a consultant. There's plenty of M&A consultants that are out there, and then obviously they'll take their fee. The point is like you've been able to sort of productize an SOP, something that it for most folks just seems incredibly complex, especially somebody without a investment banking background. Maybe it's just an entrepreneur, just or an accidental entrepreneur that all of a sudden has something that, oh my God. I mean, I remember the first time I talked to somebody, said, hey, you realize you could sell your business for X amount. I was like, I never even thought about it. That was probably 5 years ago. Like literally. I'm like, really? Somebody would buy this thing? So just the idea of growing through acquisition, you have to sort of change your mindset specifically. And then the secondary step to that is like you figured out all the hard parts and now you have sort of this playbook that you use. One of the most interesting things about this is how do you do it? Like if you're paying out, obviously you're buying a business for 2.5 times EBITDA, you're paying out 85% cash. For those of you who don't know, earnings before interest, taxes, and depreciation, amortization. It's basically what's left over after all your costs, before you pay your taxes and before you add in depreciation. So, like, how are you able to structure a deal so that you could pay 85% cash? Where did you get those funds? Like, how did you, let's talk
So
about sort of that
it's a
right
great
there.
question. So the first thing I did is I started asking our accountants
Yep.
and our network of professionals is, do you know of anyone who can help us raise funds for this?
Mm-hmm.
They happened to introduce us to a gentleman then, and all he specialized in was mezzanine debt. Let's just talk about the tech stack or the debt or the capital stack for a second, okay?
Yep.
You can borrow equity, and equity you can bring in investors on equity, and equity means they get a piece of you, they get ownership of your business, and that's a way of doing it. You can also do pure debt if you think you're going to borrow money from your bank. The probability is extremely, extremely, extremely small. There are plenty of funds out there in capital groups that are there set up to give you loans for acquisitions, and there are mezzanine debt lenders, and mezzanine are sitting somewhere between equity and debt. They take a small piece of equity and they charge debt. Now understand that the interest rate when I share with you might be high. They're sitting in the mid-teens is where they charge. Ultimately, with whatever they make from the equity, they want to be in the mid-20s. But if you think about the value of what you're buying and the EBITDA you're buying, the ROI is massive if you know how to operate the business that you're buying, you're acquiring. So again, the ROI is significant there, and debt should never scare you if you're responsible from that perspective. So we went out. We were introduced to a guy who specialized in mezzanine lending. He introduced us. He reached out. He went and helped build the deck, build the model. He reached out and set up 5 meetings for us. We got three. We got three term sheets. We picked what we felt is our favorite one, the one that seemed to be the most patient and mature and experienced of the mezzanine lenders, and they turned out to be a great partner for us. But that's really it. Let me just share this with you: is that it is so important in acquisitions is the buyer never has the same motivation as the seller. Now, what I mean that is you're a buyer in your business, you have a certain value on your business, you have certain perceptions. You automatically think that I'm an entrepreneur and the person who's selling their business has the same motivations I do, so they'll never take the offer that I really want to give them. The answer is you don't know until you ask. You don't know until you actually build the relationships and find out the driving force. Case in point, we had a brand, our supplement brand. It was doing close to 20 million a year and throwing off $3 to $4 million of cash. It became a distraction from our beauty business, and we just wanted to get rid of it. We just didn't care. We had another business which was called Bellaplex. It was a skincare business. It was doing about 10 million in revenue. It was distraction. We couldn't focus on it. We said, let's either just wind out the auto ships and shut it down. But if someone will just buy it, $10 million business, just for the cost of the inventory, and I'll tell you what, we'll fund it. We'll let them sell through the inventory, and as they do, they'll just pay us it. And that was the deal structure we did. Now, on the other side, the buyer would say, I would never sell my $10 million business for this amount because I spent all the years building it. This is the profit. You don't know the buyer's motivation. There'll be, I'm going to say, majority of businesses, they go to market. This is a really interesting stat. 80% of the businesses that go to business, I've heard as high as 90, that go to sell, never sell.
Hmm.
So what does it mean when a business doesn't sell? At some point, it's going to be closed down. 9 out of 10 businesses that go to the market will never sell. So you don't have to go for the top 1% of the most pristine, best, highest price brands or agencies out there to buy. What you're looking for those diamonds that are great brands, and the seller has different motivation. And therefore, in our process to do acquisitions, you talk with a lot of sellers. In conversations that, one thing, Ralph, that I've learned over time is most entrepreneurs love to talk about the future.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, a great question is just like, hi, it's great. Tell me about your business. And so, what are your plans for the future? Have you ever thought about selling? You could have at any conference, at any event you go to, the person sitting next to you could be the person that you're buying their business in the future. It happens.
It is amazing when you ask that question, or just about the future.
You're
What
you're
are your
you're
plan? What are your plans for your business?
you're 100%. And in the agency world, I'm seeing deals where there's 70% cash at close. I'm seeing deals where there is zero. A lot of deals where there's zero cash at close. I'm seeing a decent amount of deals at 10 to 20% cash at close. Now, when you're talking about 10 to 20%, there are so many sources of capital for that, because there are, again, if you want to go to expensive capital, there are hard money lenders that basically will give you 1 month of revenue. There's at least one investment banking firm that out there that not only brings you deal, they'll actually bring anywhere from $500,000 to $2 million of capital to the table
Mm-hmm.
with the deal. So hey, if you buy one of our agencies, we'll actually fund it if we vet you. So again, there are so many different sources of capital, and I know hundreds of them because I've been playing this game for a long time. It's just basically about creativity. But if you look at this as any game as being painful, it probably is. If you look at it as a game, an exciting one, it's a lot of fun.
Mm. I think that's where people get stuck. I think they think it's too complex and too complicated, and to get the money is too hard. Oh, I have to go to my bank. And those two things are the blockers that say, all right, I'm just going to grow on my own. I'm not going to even think about acquisition as a form in which to
Yeah.
ultimately grow. mezzanine financing obviously is something that probably for a lot of listeners are like, what the hell is that? I've never heard that term before. So there is that. And then the next question is where do you go? Where do you find these people? Like, is this a Google search, or is it like you have to be a part of this, inner circle club for rich people? Like, I think that's what a lot of
Like,
folks that I've talked to is like, well, where would you actually find these people?
yeah, it's funny, and I understand how intimidating that is. And sometimes it's knowing the right person that could just make introductions. There are plenty of people that do this for a living, and they broker deals and they broker financing, and you can find them through. Okay, here's the craziest suggestion. Insane. You put it out on your LinkedIn or your Facebook or your Instagram or all combinations of all of them is, hey, I'm looking for funding for X. Any recommendations? You'll be shocked. What I hope that your audience is doing is understanding that their social media is one of their best business tools they have, and hopefully they're producing some type of content on a regular basis that will build some level of audience that's out there. And it doesn't have to be massive investments. So when you go out there and put a request for information, you get hit with one, two, three, five, 100 different recommendations on here's an idea, here's a person, and then you just talk to those people. It's the easiest way of doing it. Is your network is incredible.
Mm.
I think people don't understand that. Yeah, and you pick up the phone, you call your accountant, other people in your professional network, and people that in mastermind groups that you're in or other industry groups, and ask them. You'll get names, and you talk to names, you get referrals. It's if you're creative, there's a lot of different areas, and I'd also go, and you can also whether you Google it or whether you use ChatGPT or Gemini, you can also refine your search and get a listing of names also.
Mm.
And again, it's if with brokers, at least you get warm introductions. They do that versus cold. But the I can share this with you that if I have capital to deploy, because that's my business and I'm there because I'm a lender, I have capital to deploy. Me sitting on the cash is not a good thing. I only make money when I'm lending money.
Right.
Therefore, I'm always looking for good deals, always. And you talk to every lender, their challenge are finding good deals and good businesses with good people. And that's the real thing. If you are, the reason why, remember, Drew and I had a $331,000 revenue business that lost money that year. We were able to borrow $15 million because we were trustworthy and we had a decent pedigree behind us, but we were buying a business that had positive cash flow. That's how we bought the business.
Mm.
When you're buying positive cash flow businesses, it's great. But also a lot of times is the seller, do you know how many agencies are out there that are 25, 30, 35 years old where the owners are just tired? They're
Yeah.
looking for and know what their number one, yes, they want their liquidity, but what is typically their number one goal?
I mean, I've talked to a lot of them. A lot of them are just like, hey, I'm just going to ride into the sunset with it, or I just haven't even thought about it.
Um,
That's usually the answer that I got. I've never thought about
well,
it. This is just, unless they have like a health scare or some
heck,
sort of life event. That's what I've found.
who would buy it? But also, what about my employees? Where's a good home for them?
Ah, yeah, of
Their
course.
employees or their family legacy. Employees been with them for 5 or 10 years. They care. You come and say, listen, I want to acquire your agencies, and basically whether I integrate it with mine or I run it separately doesn't matter. And I'm giving your employees a great home for the future.
Hmm.
And let's creative deal structures. I've seen more deals made that are extremely flexible. I mean, it could be zero cash to close. It could be 5% cash to close with really good payment terms, where the payment terms are based off of the cash flow of the profits of the business. And now here the owner is, instead of closing their agency down or having the stress of it, they enjoy the cash flow of the business without running the business for could be 3 to 5 years.
Right.
You can do a 5 year note. So the owner is out there. And yes, they're taking the risk of you doing it, but what are they going to do? Continue to run the business for 3 to 5 years?
Hmm.
For some of them is, they're pushing, they're 55, they're 60, they're 65. They have other goals in mind, and those are ideal opportunities. And there are thousands of agencies out there that meet that criteria.
Hmm.
So, like I said, um, there's significant deals that are out there. There's always access for capital, but mostly it's creative deal structures to do it. Yes, it always helps if you can find someone who has a little bit of expertise in this, and even they take a success fee on it.
Mm-hmm.
then great, because
Yeah.
you basically increase, the thing that I don't think people understand is what this means for them and their business and their exit value.
Mm.
Should we talk about that, Ralph? You brought up about exits.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say I would amend my comment in that it, y- first off, like, let me just backtrack just for a second.
Go
One
for
of
it.
the more important things that you said here was that the buyer never has the same motivation as the seller, or vice versa. And so true about the employee thing. It's unbelievable. Like, we've done some acquisitions. We engaged with you on a merger that we were going to do, like Ava, which was going to be, we ended up calling it off, but you would have been sort of that helper sort of in the middle. So, I mean, I think there's value in having that. Um, my point is that in most of the acquisitions that we've done and or slash mergers, one of the biggest negotiating points is always is I want to keep my employees. I want to take care of them, for a variety of different reasons. And I mean, that is universal because if you feel a sense of obligation, especially if it's a smaller shop, like, 20 people, 30 people less, 10, like they have, the owner has a personal relationship with every single person. So it's almost like the smaller it is, the more that becomes an issue, at least in my experience. Would you agree with that or disagree
The
with
answer
that?
is 100%. Yeah,
Yeah.
especially people is, wow, I gave the best year. I gave 5 years for, again, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years. I gave 5 years or 10 years. I worked my ass off and to make they have a successful agency. And now he just got an exit and I'm unemployed. He, he screwed me.
Yeah.
It's not what happened. There was no intention there, but
Right.
that's people's perception. So, and feeling good about your exit that you took care of people, it's just a lot of people are wired that way, but you never know what someone's motivation is. And therefore, as quickly as possible as I do my first calls with people, and second, and then give them a in-depth survey to fill out, is really trying to understand their true motivations. Because once I understand what's driving them is, and the problem is that most sellers create a narrative to what they think you want to hear. And I can promise you this, that when I'm buying a company is I want you to tell me the truth. Otherwise, we're both gonna be messed up from this. The first agency that we bought with Ava, the CEO wanted to be running the shop and be a primary person, and the owner wanted to be gone from the business. Well, since the CEO was already in place, it really helped to do that. If I buy a company and the owner says, "Well, here's all the work I'm doing, but my goal is to be transition out of the business in 12 months or 24 months," then I'll create a structure to make that possible. If they say, "No, I'm in this for the long term," and then suddenly after 12 months they say they want to go, it creates issue for both sides, and that information gets out and that motivation. So,
Mm.
and therefore matching the right. There's plenty of buyers out there for your business also. So, matching it and aligning motivation, and then creating a deal construct. This is key. Creating a deal construct that aligns motivation of the buyer and seller is really the key to every deal. Is deal craft.
Right. Agreed. So maybe getting into deal structure a bit, like I think a lot of people think to themselves, well, should I find the acquisition target first or should I find the money first or should they be done in concert with each other? Like, what's your recommendation there? Like, what does the playbook say as far as that's concerned?
Okay, find the acquisition first and then the money. However, building your network out by just asking casual conversations in people is not a bad thing to do, but you don't want to have active discussions with lenders when you don't even have a deal because you're wasting their time.
Mm.
And again, that's I believe you thoughtful about what the next few steps are in every process. But if you're working on everything in parallel, you'll get nothing done. And therefore, as go for the next big domino. And so the first big domino is finding that ideal acquisition. And depending on the acquisition and the deal structure, is going to change the type of funding you need in place. Let me throw it this way: is that you have an agency that's throwing off $1.2 million of revenue a year, and you do a deal structure that you have to come up with $100,000 cash at close. I can tell you who to turn to get that cash within 3 days.
Hmm.
It's pricey,
Hard
Not
money lender.
horrible. If you go to the right hard money lender, it's not
Yeah,
killer. And there's a lot of different sources and creative ways of getting financing to it,
sure.
deal structures. But again, you can do that on your agency. But again, everything. So before I chase where the money is, I need to find a great company to buy. And the biggest warning I'm going to give anyone is don't buy falling knives.
Hmm.
Don't buy falling knives. Um, no matter how good the deal structure is, you might end up getting cut still. And by the way, it's happened to me. I and it's and not too long ago that happened. Is I thought I was doing a great thing and helping out a company, and they were going out of business. I thought I created a deal construct that protected everyone, but things were amiss and there was a loss. Um, we rushed in too fast to do the deal because we were trying to save this company before it went out of business for the employers and employees and it's good business and everything else. So therefore, my lesson is there are so many great businesses, and I don't care what the deal and how irresistible the deal is buy good business. Otherwise, you're spending your time away from your business and fixing a problem you shouldn't be spending time on. You should be thinking about growth and opportunity and not about how do I fix what I just bought.
Mm. So I guess let's dive deeper on that one because that's a super important point. I mean, you are buying when you're buying a business, you're buying future potential, really,
Correct. Mhm.
through a trailing 12 months, valuation example, which you talked about a little bit earlier. But how do you know? Because every business is going to say, well, these are our projections and they look rosy. Like how do you know that you're not buying a falling knife? How do you
Okay.
know that you're
So
buying
perfect,
something that's going to
perfect,
have
perfect.
future value?
Let's talk about the process that we say is first of all is what I typically say in business in the whole business of generating of buying a business is kind of like a marketing campaign. The first thing you want to do is to have some ideal leads and have really good introductions because I'll share with this with you is if you're having a couple good acquisition conversations a month with potential buyers, even better if it's a couple a week. When you see a deal, you're less apt to be, if you only have one deal you're looking at and it's a competitive process and it's with a broker, you're more likely to get stuck into the momentum and get into desirability bias and commitment bias.
Mm.
And therefore, you're not looking at the data as objectively as if you have a number of options at hand. So the first thing that you do is that when you're going to process and you have your initial call, you always want to have your pretty short pre due diligence list. And it's before you go into any type of significant expenses on due diligence. You want to understand what are the most important things about this business that you have to understand. When I'm looking at an agency, what is it? I want to know their last 3 years by month of revenue and their profitability. And that's the first thing I look at.
Sure.
The next thing I want to see for the last 24 months, I want to see their revenue by client.
Yep.
Because if I look at this, and you have to be very, very careful, and I'll tell you a story about this in a minute about some oh shits when this happens, is if you look at their revenue by client and you see that their top line revenue is pretty consistent and growing, but the clients are churning and they just lost their biggest two clients and they replaced them with a handful of smaller clients. But again, what you were looking for is that stability, is that historical stability, which is a fairly good indicator of what's going to happen. If a business is growing by 10% and their attrition is low and they have consistently client retention for 2 or 3 years, and the question that I always ask in the initial discussion with them is, what percent of your business is retainer versus what percent of your business is project work?
Hmm.
The challenge with a lot of project work is you're constantly fishing for new business and scrabbling. Retainer work is really nice when they have fixed amount of clients that pay them X amount, whether it's on annual contracts or whether it's on multi-year contracts. Or so those are key indicators. So you say so it's a following. How do I know? Is if they have consistent clients that have stick, they have a nice also. When you get the client breakdown, is you're going to see that it is what percent of their clients come from, or the revenue come from one client.
Mm.
If they have significant, let's say two clients make up 80% of their business, how risky if one of the two of those clients leaves? So again, that's the predictability of is it worth going in and how risky is this?
Right.
So that's why I said those are things. The initial things I look at is I look at their profitability, their P&L, and I look at their revenue by client. At least gives me a look at it. Then I look at quality work. There's some other things to look at, but even to come up with the term sheet, I'll never even talk about deal structure before I see that.
Got it. Makes sense. How about on the e-com side? Like you've done a fair amount of M&A over there. Like what do you look for there?
So, so let me just also give one point is let's say that you go and let's just talk about client diversification, and I'm going to show you why it matters from an e-com perspective. Okay.
Hmm?
There's a deal that whenever you get whenever you do your preliminary due diligence and you do your analysis on a business, be very careful. Understand that whatever information you have is it's historical information that's no longer relevant. Your contracting can take place over the next 90 days. You're the person who's buying when you're buying the business. If they're lost their biggest client, they're probably not going to tell you.
Right.
So we're looking at to look at that they didn't lose their biggest client and they suddenly replaced it with three smaller ones. The client that's been with them for 5 years, now the business is a different risk profile. So always be getting updated financials and revenue by client. Now, what does that mean? Let's talk about when we launched, let's just say one of the platforms that I launched, we bought an Amazon brand. I won't even mention the name of it, but it was a relatively small acquisition. And for us, it was an opportunity for us to basically test the platform out, our team, and it was a good experience. But we had a lot of other things going on, so we didn't pay the typical level of attention you did because of the size of it. But we did. We kept an eye on their revenue, and this is an Amazon brand, and the revenue was consistent on a month-to-month basis and growing. 90 days after we closed, 40% of the revenue disappeared like this.
Yikes.
Oh shit, what happened? And then we looked under the hood, and what happened is that they had their core business, they had Chinese sellers that came in, undercut it, and they lost their core business 6 months before.
Oh.
But this was a couple months before we closed, but they had new seasonal products that they launched that were killer, and they made up for the revenue at the exact same time.
Huh.
But the seasonal product lasted for the season. As soon as the season ended, those products disappeared. And so looking at the top, so we did the deep dive analysis on the revenue by SKU. That was solid, consistent for all the years of the business.
Right.
We watched as we were going through the contracting phase, we were just watching the top line revenue to see the growth, and it was there. We weren't watching the details of the revenue by product.
Okay.
So again, keeping an eye on the metrics throughout your process and your team doing that is really critical, which is why we make sure we get updated financials. And in every phase of the due diligence checkoff, I have people sign off on this phase on every time as we keep on monitoring it. So.
Right. So it's the same concept in the agency space, right over to e-com. It's SKUs versus customers,
That's
and seasonal
exactly it.
fluctuations, and breaking it down by product individually.
100%.